So I wanted to throw out to the group some topics around residential housing. I'm going to start with Kerrville and expand out from there. In Kerrville, I believe the average home sells for $375 to $395,000. That is a formidable barrier for a first-time home buyer, even if it's a two-income family. It is also a formidable barrier for any public service employee, teacher, firefighter, policeman, city official, city administrator who comes to this town. And the values in Kerrville are set by the market. They're not inflated in any different way. But the issue of affordable or achievable housing is a omnipotent, all-encompassing issue. It impacts the economy of this city because we have three major employers. We have H-E-B Grocery Store, we have James Avery Jewelry, and we have Peterson Medical Systems. Each one of those needs to bring in every level of employee. If it's an entry-level position, they cannot get housing for their employees or new employees in Kerrville. My favorite example is Peterson Healthcare, who brings in mid to high-level nurses, but there's no housing available to them. And so they've rented dormitories from Schreiner University to accommodate the nurses. And that's great. You're 45 years old and you're now living in a one-room dorm. I really want to come and work at your hospital system, coupled with some other economic factors that I see, particularly around the issue of reshoring construction and resources into the United States that we're going to China. The largest the largest importer of U.S. lumber is the country of China. What if we took all of that lumber, kept it in the United States, and used it to build houses? Could we build a new series of houses, literally, that we haven't constructed since the Great Depression, starting with entry-level homes and building up from there? Is that something banks could get behind in terms of a lending program? Do we need federal assistance in that, similar to the CHIPS Act? When I look at England, where my wife is from, there are 66 million people in that country. There's almost that many people in the United States, in the state of Texas. If you are under 40, you cannot afford a home in there because of the constrictions of new home construction in England, both governmental regulation and economics. It's taken 2 or 3 generations of families out of home ownership, which I was always taught was the best investment you could ever make as an individual, was in your own home. I really thought a lot about residential construction, achievable and affordable housing, and how do we begin to look at this issue through all sectors in the United States. And I've come around to thinking we need something similar to a CHIPS Act or a Marshall Plan or something to reinvest in America that gives everybody a stake in it, from the lumber companies to the banks to the new homeowners and to the towns and municipalities that need construction. And Mike, I'm going to start with you because you have 2 homes. And so you see this in a place such as Madison, Wisconsin. You also see it in Florida. We here in the Hill Country have many second homes. We have many retirees, people who have the ability to move here and purchase a home. Is there something do the property values you see and you saw when you purchased your properties really preclude first-time home buyers or others of under 40 from getting achievable housing?
Great question. And the answer is yes. The housing market in Madison, Wisconsin is extremely robust. I have 3 adult children who are married, all living in the Madison area. And I've watched, 2 of them go through the process of buying homes. And fortunately, they were in positions because of their employment and their spouse's employment that they were sort of able to leap over the traditional starter home. But that's the very minority of people. The housing market, it's just crunched. Something goes on the market that would be a traditional starter home size, and odds are a retired person comes in and buys it up with cash and it's off the market immediately. It's just a huge housing crunch. And certainly the same thing plays out in Southwest Florida, where we have our second home. even with the hurricanes. And Hurricane Ian was particularly rough on where we have our second home. The market is strong and the barriers to entry are huge. Where we are on Sanibel Island off of Fort Myers, the people who are actually employed there live an hour away and are commuting to get there. And it's crazy. They can't get employees, the resorts, the restaurants, the hotels, they're woefully understaffed. And it's because people can't afford to live there and work there. So in all parts of the country, they're experiencing this problem. Bart?
Yeah, Tom, I think we have to face up to the fact that this is one of the great crises in our country today, the affordability of housing. Clearly, housing markets work for people of means. They work very well. But for people of lower means, the markets simply do not function in a way that provides them opportunities for decent, safe housing. And we have to face up to that. Now, we know that the government for a long time, governments of states and the federal government have known that we need programs and public policy that advances opportunities for affordable housing for people making lower incomes or even middle incomes. And so there are all kinds of programs at the federal and state level to try to encourage affordable housing, but they're very complicated and they ultimately can't come anywhere near to meeting the demand. So your analogy to a Marshall Plan for affordable housing in this country is, I think, right on target. I think we have to think differently. We can make progress around the margins, and we have as a country, but it's only around the margins. The problem actually has gotten much worse, and I don't see an end to it if we don't approach this from a public policy standpoint, saying that this is a crisis, and we have to make things simpler and invest more in creating housing opportunities for people at the middle and lower income levels, who really are the folks who are serving this country day in and day out by going to work and building communities and building companies. And the average American cannot afford decent, safe, affordable housing in this country today in most cities.
John, I know you have looked at targeted programs in the financial or in the banking industry designed to help certain communities. Is this something that banks could be a part of a program with an appropriate governmental either push or oversight, or is it something that banks really want to stay away from, in your opinion?
I don't think banks want to stay away from it. I think, as Bart just said, the need is profound. The fundamental issue is housing just costs too much compared to the wages that the average American makes. And there's a disconnect. And so we need to have more affordable housing or more rent subsidies. I've been involved with programs that we have financed projects that have rent vouchers where the federal government pays part of the rents, not all the rents. And I've been involved in tax credit programs, the low-income housing tax credits, where the tax credits are sold and the money that from the profits from selling the tax credits go into the project to help build the project. The problem is everything is, to Bart points out, it's a little bit piecemeal, and the supply that comes out of that is inadequate for the big demand. And most importantly, they're not really efficient programs. I mean, recent projects in San Francisco area have been building low-income housing tax credit projects for $1 million a unit. But you could build market rate projects cheaper. In Chicago, that I have firsthand knowledge with, you can build market rate apartment projects for $400,000, $500,000 a unit, or maybe less in some instances. Tax credit deals I've seen in Chicago are at $400,000 or $500,000 a unit to build a much more modest structure than a market rate project. So they're inefficient and the volume's inadequate. I personally think something that's well thought through and like a Marshall Plan, like you've described, where we're going to target a much larger volume. Here's how the incentives we're going to provide, and here's how it's going to work, is what's called for. But if you can combine the market rate incentives of our capitalist system with some government subsidies to encourage it, the marriage of the two could be profound in the volume we could come up with. But as it is now, it's inadequate and nobody wants to let go of what we have because people are making money off that and they don't want to make big changes to that. So we're sort of stuck in the mud.
Gil, I'm going to turn to you as perhaps our longest Kerrville resident. And at least since I've been here, this has been a topic of conversation. It's a conversation in businesses. It's a conversation at the Economic Council. It's a conversation at the City of Commerce, Chamber of Commerce. Is there really anything a city such as the size of Kerrville can do? And if so, have you seen it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that the city of Kerrville can do and other cities can do. Obviously, there's a lot of input costs to building residential housing. And one of the primary ones is infrastructure costs. Every house that's built has to have some infrastructure to it, whether that's housing, water, sewer, electrical, and all that costs money. So big developments usually want to do all that infrastructure up front so that when they build houses, they just have to connect as they move along. In Kerrville, I'm sure there's been a recent initiative from the city to help a local housing developer with that problem. They've offered to subsidize the costs for that developer when it comes to infrastructure. Now, I'm not a real big proponent of government stepping in to help out things because, as John pointed out, sometimes they don't make it cheaper, they make it more expensive. And I'm certainly not advocating that we don't need any government help at all, but sometimes they make it more complicated. I think the best thing that local governments like Kerrville can do is help with infrastructure costs to help defray some of those costs, but then also look at maybe innovating and working with builders to say, hey, listen, how can we bring down the cost of these homes or these developments? Can we use innovative building techniques? Why does it always have to be stick built homes? Why can't we use steel frame housing? I don't know if that's cheaper or not. What about 3D printing? What about mobile home communities? A lot of people would tell you that, hey, listen, if you want affordable housing, we've already got those options. It's called a mobile home. It's cheaper. Can be very nice. But guess what? When you talk to local residents about mobile home communities, most people would tell you, I don't want that next to me. It's going to devalue my property. So there's a strange dynamic that goes on locally when it comes to affordable housing. Everybody knows we need it. Everybody agrees that we need it. The government is agreeing to pay for some of it, but they also want to dictate how, what, when, where, and who can buy it. And that's where the things get complicated. I think there's a lot of options that local governments can help with, but it's very difficult to implement a nationwide plan because every community is a little different. Some communities would agree to one type of housing, other communities wouldn't. But I think there's a lot of things that this crisis can really help with innovation, but people have to be open to that innovation. And it could mean that we solve the problem using the available tools we already have, but people are going to have to understand that this is what needs to be done. And frankly, there are some people that do not need a house. They're not very good with paying taxes, insurance, taking care of it, maintaining properties, because every home requires maintenance. And if all you're going to do is buy it, live in it, and never cut the grass, you're not a good neighbor. Or if you're going to buy it and never fix the roof when we get hail damage, that's not a good neighbor. And guess what? You're driving up insurance costs for everybody else. So I think it's important that government helps, but there's a limit, and it's going to be a struggle, I think, for all of us to figure out what is that limit.
Walter Calhoun?
I want to amplify some of those comments I just heard because I think they were not only fascinating, but very educational for all of us to hear. I'm a Black man who was making over $100,000 as a trial lawyer before being hit by a car, hospitalized for 7 months. I haven't practiced law in 22 years. I had a mortgage at that point that was being serviced and was in good shape. But after that accident, that real estate became my piggy bank to finance my children's education, which was so much more important to me than where I live personally. I am very happy with what I did for my children when I did it, and I would do it again, even though some people might say that was morally unacceptable because as a lawyer, I should have known that I signed a contract and I should have serviced that contract first and given the lenders back their money before taking money out of the house to finance my children's education. But I think you also said something that was very important in that some people shouldn't own real estate. Some people should be prevented from owning real estate because of the circumstances they're in and not the dreams they want to believe they should receive as being good Americans who want to succeed like everyone else. And right now, I pay $650 in rent for a nice one bedroom suite in a house. And there's no amount of no real estate anywhere that I think I would invest in to give me the real estate advantages that incur from buying a home over time because there's nobody that's going to be able to build a piece of property for me that has to be financed at $650. That's going to make the whole thing work out in math.
Right.
And I think what our country has had a hard time accepting are the ramifications of the math problem. I've heard a lot of talk about interest rates here today. I haven't heard any talk about the $31 trillion of debt we have and how that's affecting the whole interest rate situation, not only now, but what's going to happen going forward. So I think until we start ending these government programs, until we stop encouraging people to stop relying on themselves and what they can bring to the table, we're going to continue to have these problems because, as we're seeing, they're only getting bigger because the regulation doesn't capture the people like me who was able to game the system, so to speak, by not paying back my lender so that I could send my children to great schools and become educated in a way I couldn't have done without that money.
Bart,
Could I just say another thing along these lines? We've both Walter and Gil talking about government programs and some of the challenges that surround government programs. And I was involved in local government in Indianapolis a number of years ago, and I remember being struck when I was actively involved in issues around homelessness that everybody who worked in that social service arena around homelessness always said that the first solution to the problem of homelessness is more homes. We just need more places for people to live. Now, of course, we know homelessness is a much more complex social problem than that, but it does stem, at least in part, from a lack of affordable places for people to live. And I think that there can be, back to the Marshall Plan concept, there can be ways for the government to approach things where they're not living people's lives for them, where they're not doing the hard work for people, as both you, Gil, and Walter pointed out, but rather they're increasing the amount of stock. We just need more homes. Somebody's got to build more homes. The market is not producing those homes. If we had enough housing for everybody, the cost would go down. The price would go down because the supply would be considerably higher to meet the demand that's out there right now. So in some ways, it's that it can be that simple without devising these incredibly complex programs where government sort of starts stepping into people's personal lives.
No, I agree. The home affordability problem, it's a complex issue, and there's not one single solution. It's going to take a multifaceted approach with a lot of different solutions and for different communities too, because you can't say that the solution to the problem in Kerrville, Texas is the same solution to the problem in San Francisco, California. You can't. They're just two different places. And I think what the best way to solve the affordability problem is government, the private sector, employers need to get together and come up with a plan. Is it easy? Is it going to be expensive? And who's going to pay for it? That's where the trick comes in. Who's going to pay for it? Because all these plans have a cost. What's the cost? Well, I don't know, but you got to start somewhere. And if you don't at least talk about it and start working towards a solution, you'll never get a plan.
Gentlemen, we are at the end of our time. So I wanted to thank John, Mike, Bart, Walter, Andrew, and Gil. This has been great. We can continue this conversation.